Hey, welcome to Crime Time 911. You know how some stories feel like they were made for the movies? The kind where you hear the plot and think, no way that actually happened. That's exactly how people react when they hear about Frank Abagnale Jr. But here's the thing. It did happen, or at least most of it did. And the parts that didn't, well, they're still part of the legend. Frank's story isn't just about clever schemes or fake identities. It's about a kid, a teenager, who ran away from home and somehow talked his way into living a life most people couldn't even imagine. He didn't just lie. He became the lie. And for years, the world believed him. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this incredible tale together. Frank William Abagnale Jr. was born on April 27, 1948 in Bronxville, New York. He was the third of four children in a middle-class family. His father, Frank Sr., was a successful businessman. Charming, well-dressed, the kind of guy who could sell anything to anyone. His mother, Paulette, was French, and Frank grew up speaking both English and French fluently. By all accounts, Frank had a pretty normal childhood. He went to school, played with his siblings, and idolized his father. Frank Sr. was his hero, someone he looked up to, someone he wanted to be like. They were close, really close. And that bond would shape a lot of what came later. But things at the home weren't perfect. Frank's parents had a rocky marriage, and when he was just 16, they divorced. That moment, the divorce, was a turning point. Frank was devastated. He was forced to choose which parent to live with, and the emotional weight of the decision was too much. So he ran. He didn't run away in the dramatic movie-style sense. He didn't pack a bag and disappear into the night. He just left. Took off. No plan, no money, no destination. Just a kid trying to escape the pain of watching his family fall apart. And that's where the story really begins. Frank found himself alone in New York City, trying to survive. He was 16, broke and desperate. But he was also smart, really smart. And he had something else, charm. Frank could talk his way into anything. He had a way of making people believe him, trust him, and even admire him. And he realized that if he could convince people he was older, more experienced, more professional, he could get by. So he started experimenting. He altered his driver's license to make himself look older. He opened bank accounts using fake information, and then he discovered something that would become his signature move, check fraud. Back in the 1960s, checks were everywhere. People used them for everything: groceries, rent, travel. Banks didn't have the sophisticated systems they do today. Frank realized that if he wrote checks from accounts that didn't have money or altered checks to increase the amount, he could cash them before anyone noticed. It started small, a few checks here and there, but Frank was ambitious. He didn't want to scrape by. He wanted to live well. So he got creative. He figured out that if he opened multiple accounts at different banks, he could write checks from each one and deposit them into the other, creating a cycle that looked legitimate, at least for a while. He also discovered that if he printed his own checks, he could make them look real enough to fool tellers. And it worked. Frank started cashing checks all over New York. He dressed the part, suits, ties, polished shoes. He acted confident, professional, and people believed him. He was just a teenager, but he looked and sounded like a young businessman. But Frank didn't stop there. He wanted more. He wanted adventure. And that's when he came up with one of his most famous personas, the airline pilot. So here he was, 16, maybe 17, already running check schemes and living on the edge. But Frank wasn't content with just cashing fake checks in New York. He wanted more. He wanted to see the world. He wanted to do it in style. That's when he came up with one of the most boldest ideas of his life. He would become a pilot. Now, Frank didn't want to fly planes. He wasn't interested in actually being in control of an aircraft. What he wanted was the uniform, the access, the credibility. Because in the 1960s, airline pilots were treated like celebrities. They were respected, admired, and trusted. And most importantly, they could travel for free. Frank started by doing his homework. He learned everything he could about Pan Am, Pan American World Airways, which at the time was one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. He studied their uniforms, their procedures, even their terminology. He figured out what kind of ID badge their pilots carried, what their pay stubs looked like, and how they interacted with airport staff. Then he got to work creating his own version of a Pan Am pilot's uniform. He found a tailor who had specialized in airline uniforms and told him he was a pilot who had lost his original. The tailor didn't ask too many questions. Frank walked out with a crisp navy blue suit, gold stripes on the sleeves, and a cap with a Pan Am logo. He also forged a Pan Am employee ID and pilot's license. And just like that, he became Captain Frank Williams. Now, here's where it gets wild. Frank didn't just wear the uniform, he used it. He walked into airports, flashed his ID, and asked to deadhead. That's airline lingo for when a pilot hitches a ride in the cockpit jump seat to reposition for another flight. It was a common practice and nobody questioned it. After all, he looked the part. Frank flew all over the world: Paris, Tokyo, Miami, Los Angeles. He stayed in luxury hotels, ate at fine restaurants, and lived like a rock star, all on the airline's dime. He wasn't buying tickets. He wasn't booking rooms. He was just showing up, smiling, and letting the uniform do the talking. And it worked for months. He even started dating flight attendants. He'd meet them on flights, charm them, and spend weekends in different cities. He was living a fantasy and doing it all before his 20th birthday. But Frank wasn't just using the pilot persona for travel. He was also using it to cash checks. Banks trusted pilots. They were seen as responsible, upstanding professionals. So when Frank walked into a bank in uniform and asked to cash a check, tellers didn't hesitate. He'd write checks for a few $100s, flash a smile, and walk out with cash. He also came up with clever ways to manipulate checks. One of his favorite tricks was to print his account number on blank deposit slips and leave them in bank lobbies. Unsuspecting customers would grab the slips, fill them out, and deposit money, not realizing it was going into Frank's account. It was simple, brilliant, and completely under the radar. But as with all things, the more he did it, the riskier it became. Pan Am started getting suspicious. They had no record of Captain Frank Williams, and the FBI was starting to connect the dots. There was a young man cashing fake checks all over the country, often dressed as a pilot. They didn't know who he was yet, but they knew he was out there. So after months of flying around the world as a Pan Am pilot, Frank started to feel the pressure. He could sense that people were asking questions. Pan Am had no record of him. The FBI was starting to connect the dots, and Frank, always one step ahead, knew it was time to change identities again. This time, he went for something completely different. He moved to Georgia and decided to become a doctor. Now let's pause here for a second. Becoming a doctor isn't just about wearing a white coat and using big words. It's years of school, training, and experience. But Frank wasn't interested in practicing medicine. He just wanted the credibility, the respect, and the safety that came with the title. He claimed to have a Harvard medical degree and somehow landed a position supervising interns at a local hospital. And here's the wild part. He didn't actually treat patients. He mostly observed, asked questions, and let the interns do the work. He was charming, confident, and just knowledgeable enough to sound convincing. People believed him. They trusted him. And for a while, it worked. But again, the pressure of pretending to be a doctor started to wear on him. He worried that someone would figure it out. He knew he was playing a dangerous game. So, once again, he moved on. Next stop, Louisiana. Frank decided to try his hand at law. He forged a Harvard Law School transcript and applied to take the Louisiana bar exam. And here's the thing, he passed. Not on the first try, but on the third. Think about that. He was barely 20 years old, had never gone to law school, and yet he passed the bar exam. That says something about his intelligence, his ability to study, and his determination. For a while, he worked at the Louisiana Attorney General's office, blending in with real lawyers. He attended meetings, reviewed documents, and played the part. Again, he didn't stay long. The risk of being exposed was too high. But the fact that he pulled it off at all was astonishing. And through all of this, the pilot, the doctor, the lawyer, Frank kept cashing checks. That was his bread and butter. He walked into the banks, dressed in whatever persona he was using at the time, and asked to cash a check. People didn't hesitate. He looked the part, he sounded the part, and that was enough. But the walls were closing in. The FBI was getting closer. They had reports from banks, airlines, and hospitals. They knew there was someone out there using fake identities, cashing checks, and slipping through the cracks. They didn't have a name yet, but they were building a profile. Frank could feel it. He was constantly looking over his shoulder, changing cities, switching identities. The thrill was starting to fade. The lies were piling up. And the weight of it all was becoming too much. He was still just a kid, barely 21, living a life that was exciting, yes, but also exhausting. And then, finally, it caught up with him. By the time Frank turned 21, he had lived more lives than most people do in a lifetime. He'd been a pilot, a doctor, a lawyer, and a check-cashing wizard. He traveled the world, stayed in luxury hotels, charmed his way through every situation, but the walls were closing in. The FBI had been tracking him for years. They didn't know his name at first, but they knew his patterns. A young man, often dressed as a pilot, cashing checks in cities across the country. The checks were fake, but they were good, really good. And whoever was behind them was smart, fast, and slippery. In the movie Catch Me If You Can, the chase is dramatized as a game between Frank and a single FBI agent named Carl Hanratty, played by Tom Hanks. In real life, it was a team of agents, but the essence of the chase was real. Frank was elusive. He had an uncanny ability to sense when the heat was on. If he thought the FBI was getting close in one city, he'd vanish and pop up in another. He changed names, changed jobs, changed cities. He was like smoke, visible but impossible to grab. Eventually, though, his luck ran out. In 1969, Frank was arrested in France. He had been living there under yet another alias, continuing his check scams. French authorities caught him, and he was sentenced to prison. He served time in France, then in Sweden, and finally in the United States. By the time he was brought back to the U.S., he was just 21 years old. 21. And already he had lived a life that felt like fiction. Now, you'd think that would be the end of the story, that Frank would spend years behind bars reflecting on his choices. But that's not what happened. Because the FBI saw something in Frank, they realized that the same skills he'd used to outsmart banks, airlines, and law enforcement could be valuable. Who better to help catch fraudsters than someone who had been one? So they offered him a deal. He could serve out his sentence, or he could help them. He could work with the FBI, advising agents on fraud prevention, helping them understand how people like him operated. It wasn't a get-out-of-jail-free card. He still had to serve time, but it was a chance to do something different, a chance to rebuild. So Frank took the deal. At first, it was strange. He was sitting across from agents who had spent years chasing him, people who had studied his movements, tracked his aliases, and tried to catch him. Now they were asking him questions, listening to his advice, and learning from him. He started out small, reviewing cases, analyzing forged documents, explaining how check fraud worked. He showed agents how con artists created fake identities, how they manipulated bank systems, and how they used charm and confidence to bypass suspicion. And slowly, Frank began to rebuild his life. He didn't go back to the flashy lifestyle. No more impersonations, no more schemes. He kept his head down, did the work, and earned trust. Real trust this time. Eventually, he was released from prison, and instead of slipping back into old habits, he kept going. He built a career as a security consultant, advising banks, corporations, and government agencies on fraud prevention. He gave lectures, wrote books, and became a respected figure in the world of financial security. It was a complete transformation, from runaway teenager to global imposter, and then from prisoner to advisor. And that's what makes Frank's story so compelling. It's not just about the schemes. It's about the turn. The moment when someone who had spent years deceiving the world decided to help protect it instead. He didn't just change his behavior, he changed his purpose. Frank went on to work with the FBI for decades. He helped develop systems to detect fraud, identity theft, and other forms of deception. He trained agents, spoke at conferences, and became a go-to expert in the field. He also started his own consulting firm, working with major corporations to improve their security protocols. He advised banks on how to spot suspicious activity, helped airlines tighten their hiring processes, and taught businesses how to protect themselves from internal threats. And through it all, he stayed grounded. He didn't seek fame. He didn't chase the headlines. He just did the work. Of course, his story became famous anyway. The book Catch Me If You Can, co-written with Stan Redding, was published in 1980. It told Frank's story in vivid detail. The impersonations, the travel, the chase. It was a hit, and in 2002, it adapted into a film directed by Steven Spielberg, starring Leonardo DiCaprio as Frank and Tom Hanks as the FBI agent chasing him. The movie was a success. It brought Frank's story to a whole new audience, and while some details were dramatized, as they always are in Hollywood, the core of the story remained intact. A teenager ran away from home, reinvented himself over and over again, and eventually turned his life around. It's a story of deception, yes, but it's also a story of redemption. Frank also became a public speaker. He traveled the country and the world telling his story, not to glorify what he'd done, but to show how easy it had been, how systems could be fooled, how trust could be exploited, and how important it was to stay vigilant. He spoke at universities, law enforcement conferences, and corporate events, and every time people listened, because Frank wasn't just telling a story, he was offering a warning. And then, of course, there was the movie. In 2002, Steven Spielberg brought Frank's story to the big screen with Catch Me If You Can. It captured the charm, the audacity, and the sheer improbability of Frank's life. It showed the cat and mouse game, the disguise, the near misses, and it introduced a whole new generation to the legend of Frank Abagnale Jr. But here's where things get complicated. Because as Frank's story became more famous, people started asking questions. How much of it was true? How much of it had been embellished? And how much had been invented entirely? Over the years, journalists and researchers have dug into Frank's claims. Some of them hold up, others not so much. For example, there's little evidence that he actually worked as a doctor or lawyer for any significant amount of time. Some of the companies he claimed to have fooled say they had no record of him, and some of the timelines don't quite add up. Frank has always maintained that his story is true, or at least mostly true. He's admitted that some of the details were dramatized for the book and the movie, but he insists that the core of the story is accurate. And maybe that's part of the legacy too. Because Frank's story isn't just about what happened, it's about how we tell stories, how we remember them, how we shape them over time. It's about the line between the truth and myth, and how sometimes that line gets blurry. But even if some of the details are fuzzy, the impact is real. Frank Abagnale Jr. went from being one of the most wanted con artists in the world to one of the most respected voices in fraud prevention. He turned his life around. He used his past to build a future. He helped countless people and organizations protect themselves from deception. That's the legacy, not the fake checks, not the uniform, not the aliases. The legacy is the turn, the choice to change, the decision to use what he knew to help others. And maybe that's the most important part of the story, because we all make mistakes. We all have chapters we'd rather rewrite. But what matters most is what we do next, how we grow, how we change, and how we use our experiences, even the painful ones, to make something better. Frank Abagnale Jr. did that. And whether you see him as a genius, a myth maker, or something in between, one thing's for sure, his story left a mark. So that's the story of Frank Abagnale Jr., the teenager who ran away from home, reinvented himself over and over again, and eventually found a way to turn his past into something meaningful. It's a story of deception, yes, but it's also a story of transformation, of second chances, of what happens when someone decides to stop running and start rebuilding. Don't forget to follow, like, and share. It helps more people discover these stories and keeps the conversation going. Thanks for listening to Crime Time 911. Stay safe, stay curious, and remember to always trust your gut.